welcome to my presentation. I hope that you will enjoy it and also gain something of value as well. So as you can see from the title, I'm going to be focusing on text-based tasks within a TBLT framework. So we have some important terms there that I'd like to maybe clarify from the start. First, we have TBLT, task-based language teaching, which in many ways is seen as the most evolved version of communicative language teaching. And also I think TBLT has become the dominant language teaching methodology in second language learning and teaching. So I'll be describing a lesson framework based on TBLT. And of course in TBLT the key word is tasks. And in TBLT tasks have a very specific definition, which I will talk about shortly. And of course, I've got text-based tasks. So the task will be related to a particular text that the students will have read and or have viewed or listened to. So when I say text, it's not just written text. It can be any kind of text, including a video, an audio text, like that. And it can also be not just paper, but web-based as well. Okay? All right, so just to let you know what I'm going to be talking about more specifically, I thought first I'm just going to go quickly through the lesson framework and also to justify some theoretically TBLT and also let you know the lesson outcomes, because I will be giving an example of a lesson based on TBLT, so I'll let you know the lesson outcomes as well. And then I'll give you examples of lessons based on text-based tasks. So I'll put up the first one. So the first one is actually a prediction task based on a news article. And the title is "The Boy Who Came Out from the Cold." And most of my talk will be related to this particular lesson. Okay? So there's a whole lesson that can be made from this. And if I have time, we'll see if I can give you just another brief example of how to create a TBLT lesson based on video. And this would be the Moulin Rouge movie trailers, the movie. And in this one, students compared two different movie trailers, one based that was created for the Japanese audience, and another one created for the North American audience. And the two trailers are vastly different. So the task would be revolved around trying to compare these two trailers. And then I probably won't have time for this, but another example that's a little bit more grammar-based is the dog attack, but I don't think I'll have time for that. But definitely let's start with the first one here. And also my lesson, all of these three tasks can be done with 030, 040, 050 level students. Okay? But it'll be targeted specifically for 040. Okay? But they can be tweaked here and there for 030 or 050. All right, so now I'm just going to go through the lesson framework. And as I mentioned before, the key aspects in task-based language teaching is the task itself, which I kind of put in a little bit bigger letters there. And what's very important here for the task is that the task needs to be interactive. So it has to be accomplished and done in either pairs or small groups. And also that the task needs to be goal-oriented. So there's something that the small group has to achieve. And it also has to be reported. So the results also need to be reported as well. It can be a verbal report or it can be a written report. But it's something that they have to do together, and they have to interact together to achieve the goal of the task. And before reporting, there's kind of the planning stage, which I'll come back to shortly. However, before the task itself, there's the pre-task stage, which is very, very important. This is where the schema building occurs, especially in relation to text-based tasks. So before listening, or before viewing, or before reading a text, you should spend some good quality time getting them ready in terms of content schema, and also, if you feel it's appropriate, vocabulary schema as well. Maybe some of the language in the text could be could be overly difficult for them, so you could maybe pre-teach them at this stage. So this is what occurs in the pre-task. Now, what is different between TBLT and more traditional approaches to a lesson or to teaching, especially the more traditional grammar-based approaches, is that the language form focus occurs after students have already processed and produced language for meaning, with a focus on meaning. And ultimately, the key to success in second language learning and second language acquisition is really the learner has to balance the development of what we call fluency and the development of accuracy. So when we say fluency, we're talking about the ability to, this applies to both the receptive skills and the productive skills. Fluency just doesn't apply only to speaking, which most people might think, but it applies to reading fluency, writing fluency, etc. So just this ability to come out with language fairly easily without too much thought involved in it. So this fluency development is very, very important. But of course, the accuracy development is also important. Again, this accuracy can apply to the four skills as well. Okay. And we can see here that TBLT, especially in the pre-task and task cycle stages, where the students are mainly focusing on meaning and fluency development. However, there are little opportunities for accuracy focus or form focus even in the pre-task and task cycle. In the pre-task, as I mentioned before, pre-teaching some vocabulary could be done. So this has a vocabulary form focus application. And also, because the students have to report their result, they have to plan it a little bit. And the report is a public type of language. It's giving a presentation to the small group is a presentation to the rest of the class, or they have to write their report. So as soon as students know there's a public language involved, automatically the brain starts to think a little bit more about grammatical elements and accuracy related language. Okay? So there's a little bit of accuracy and form focus could be happening there. And of course, during the task itself, while students are interacting with a focus on meaning, there are sometimes opportunities for a spontaneous focus on form, where the student gets stuck, they don't know the vocabulary expression, another student might notice a grammar mistake they might have made, so there's more natural opportunities there. And then of course the form focus at the end is where most of the accuracy development occurs. Okay? So this is certainly one of the objectives in TBLT and in any lesson framework where there's this development not only of fluency but also accuracy in the learning. Okay? And just to highlight the motivational aspect as well, because the tasks are goal-oriented, that in itself is motivating in itself. A students know that there's some goal they have to achieve, that triggers motivation. And also because they have to publicly display their language, also that is kind of the pushing them a little bit, pushing them in terms of challenge, and which is related to motivation as well. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that task has a kind of specific definition in TBLT. And certainly for me, one aspect that definitely has to be included is that the task has to be motivationally engaging. Okay? As I mentioned, they have to be interactive, so students do have to interact either with one person or 2 or 3 other people. And when they're doing the task itself, the task has to be with an emphasis on communicating meaning. It's not practicing forms or repeating forms. Students have to struggle to communicate to accomplish the goal of the task. Okay? There has to be a clearly stated goal, and students need to produce some kind of outcome that has to be reported. Okay? And, oh, yes, well, just theoretically, TBLT is supported both theoretically and empirically. A lot of research studies have found benefits to this. You can think of Rod Ellis, Martin Bygate, and Peter Skian, for example. These are some theoretical proponents of TBLT. And of course all the empirical studies as well have shown the benefits because it seems to satisfy most of the conditions that are necessary for acquisition, which I'm going to highlight soon. So now I've got Michael Long's three-way distinction between focus on meaning, focus on form in the singular sense, and focus on forms in the plural sense. So focus on meaning, I think you can understand what this means. It's basically, so when learners are either processing language or producing language, they will sometimes be doing one of these three things. So focus on meaning occurs when learners are concerned with communication and producing and understanding messages. Okay? So it's not just producing, but it's understanding messages, understanding the meaning, and trying to produce meaning that will be understood by the other person. And when students are doing a lot of that, that's going to help their fluency. Reading fluency, speaking fluency, writing fluency, etc. Okay? Now, this is where Long makes the distinction between focus on form in the singular sense. So I'll just put up the meaning one. So the distinction between form and forms. Focus on form in the singular sense is, I've already mentioned it a little bit already. Focus on form in the singular sense occurs when learners are initially or have initially focused on meaning and are now thinking about or talking about form. So the focus on form occurs within a focus on meaning context, within a focus on meaning context. So the focus on form in the singular sense is more spontaneous and in the moment type of, it's not pre-planned. Okay? Focus on forms in the plural sense, I'll just put up the singular one. Focus on forms in the plural sense is the traditional grammar approach where a syllabus is based on graded grammar structures. And these are kind of pre-taught in advance of activities designed to practice them. Okay? So you can think about PPP, for example, presentation, practice, production. Some of you might be familiar with this. So the teacher comes to class with the main focus is the teaching of a particular grammar structure. So they present this grammar structure, they explain the grammar structure to the students. Then students kind of practice those grammar structures through repetition and fill in the blanks. And then there's this third P, which tries to add a more communicative aspect within the framework, where students get to try to still produce those grammar structures, but in a way where they're talking about themselves in real situations or things like that. Now, research is showing that the focus on form in the singular sense is more effective. It leads to longer-term retention within the learner. Okay? When students spontaneously start to think about form, or they start to think about form after they've already processed or produced language for meaning, then those grammar forms tend to stick and stay there. The PPP approach, which is very behaviorist, studies seem to show that students, even though you have the students practice and you teach this grammar structure over and over and you have them learn it until they're blue in the face, during the lesson they're producing the language correctly, but during the break when you have a conversation with them, the same form you just practiced is suddenly gone. Okay? So, there's been some criticisms on the behaviorist PPP approach because students either do not use them in real situations or they still produce them incorrectly. Okay? This is not to say that this is not to devalue this approach, because there are benefits. And I think this kind of teaching does have its benefits, especially for very low-level students, to get to see the grammar, this more deductive approach is actually quite useful for those low-level learners. have the teacher explain the grammar as well can be useful. Okay? But in terms of long-term retention, the studies are not so positive. Okay? So getting back to the framework here, so lots of focus on meaning in the pre-task and the task cycle, with occasional focus on form in the pre-task, and here the more natural within the moment type of focusing on form in the planning stage as they write their report or they plan what they're going to say to the rest of the class. The more spontaneous one, and that's where the teacher can come in as well. Now, the TBLT framework doesn't disregard the Michael Long's focus on forms in the plural sense, because the practice part here does a lot of that stuff. The more analyzing focus on form is where students are given a text and it's more inductive. They try to figure things out themselves before the teacher gives the answer all the time. Okay? But both of them, both inductive and deductive ways of teaching have their benefits. Okay? But as I mentioned earlier, the key thing here is that students need to do this, that the strong focus on form needs to occur after students have already processed language and or produced language for meaning. Okay? So this is where TBLT differs from the more traditional approaches. Okay, now research has basically shown that there are 4 essential conditions for successful second language acquisition. Okay? And I think I showed this before when I gave the IT presentation at one of our meetings. And usually I like to ask the audience what they think, but I'll just go ahead here. Okay, so of course, one that cannot be disregarded at all is a high level of motivation. And okay, there's plenty of research studies from Howard Gardner to Zoltan Dornier. Motivation is definitely seen as a key ingredient for successful second language acquisition. And I think some people might say, oh, well, students will either have motivation or they won't. But in my opinion, the teacher can have an extremely big role here. Okay? And any lesson should incorporate this. Second one, of course, is exposure to L2 input. But the input, however, needs to be comprehensible, yet authentic. Authentic language. So not overly simplistic language, but yet comprehensible. So this is Krashen, of course. I'm not going to go into Krashen. I think you're all familiar with Krashen, the benefits of receiving comprehensible input. Okay? If the input is beyond the student's knowledge, there's going to be blockage there. It's going to be just too much for them. So it does have to be comprehensible. And in the example I'm going to show you, and I think short, authentic texts are best for this. If we're talking about text-based tasks, I really think that short, authentic texts are best. And all 3 that I have as my example are examples of short, authentic text. Okay? And the next one is opportunities to produce the language for true communicative purposes. So the students have to be involved in communicating meaning. It's not repeating language, it's not practicing language, but struggling to communicate. They have to focus on meaning. Okay? Now, both in first language acquisition and second language acquisition, if you can have a very high level of motivation and you can receive lots of input, but if you have those 2 and you don't have the output, well, you can forget it. Okay? There's even first language acquisition studies that show that at some point students have to start coming out with language. Okay? Either by speaking or by writing. And there's a lot of language learning benefits occurring there. The big name there is Merrill Swain in the output hypothesis. Okay? Now, some people would say that these 3 are enough for successful second language acquisition. However, there's a 4th one. And the 4th one is definitely applicable when it comes to teenagers and adults. They also need opportunities and the willingness the focus on language form. Here was the accuracy comes in. Okay. And a big name there is Richard Schmidt's noticing hypothesis. And Richard Schmidt often gives the example of WES. If you're familiar with second language acquisition. Schmidt talked about this Japanese learner who was living in Hawaii. And WES was extremely good socially. Not afraid. He didn't have the affective filter happening there. He would just come up with language. He didn't worry about grammar at all. But he never focused on form. And Wes's language was very limited in terms. He was able to express his meanings across, but always using the same simplistic vocabulary. And of course, he had a lot of grammar problems. Okay? So students also need to have a focus and notice particular language forms when they're processing and producing language. And Richard Schmidt would also say that the focus on form in the singular sense that I mentioned earlier is best for noticing to occur. And these are my outcomes for any lesson that I give. All of this has to occur in one lesson. And also, I like to integrate skills. In one lesson, students need to be developing their speaking, listening, reading, and writing, somehow. And in one lesson, even in one task, you can do that. Okay? And in the examples I'm going to show, I'm going to show that. All right, so these are things that teachers need to bring into their classrooms. All four of these things. Okay, now let's see an example lesson. So the first one is a prediction task. And so this is a prediction task. So before students will read the text, or listen to the text, or view the text, they're going to predict the content of the text. This is what we mean by a text-based prediction task. Okay? But first you have to give them a little bit of information to help them predict. Okay? And prediction tasks are also a kind of schema building before they read or listen to a text. So before you have students read or listen to a text, you can have them predict the content of the text. And as you probably know, there are a lot of benefits to schema building. Firstly, it's going to get them more curious about the text and more motivationally engaged. And then secondly, studies show that students will comprehend the text more if that schema building has occurred before they read. So they're going to comprehend more, and they're going to also process the reading text more quickly. If it's a listening text, they will be able to, so processing the text more quickly and or more easily. Okay? So schema building is very important, and this is why I really like to use a lot of prediction tasks in my lessons. So just to give you the simple procedure here, So first, students get to see parts of the text. Maybe the title, maybe the first sentence. Okay? And based on those parts of the text, they predict the task. And of course, after they predict and present their predictions, remember this is where the reporting occurs. This will be a verbal report. In pairs, I'm going to show you an example shortly. And then, of course, after presentations, the students will be very curious at this point to read the text. Okay? And then after that, of course, in TBLT, we need to focus on form. And we're going to take a look at some language in the text. And let's look at vocabulary, grammar, or even pronunciation, which I'm going to show a little bit later. Okay, so you give them the title here at first, probably, and maybe you want, in terms of pre-task, maybe you can focus on the word cold, and you can ask the students, okay, when you think of the word cold, what expressions or what vocabulary comes to your mind? What do you think of when you think cold? And then usually the students come up with some vocabulary related to cold, chilly, okay, freezing, things like that. So you spend a little bit of time collecting their thoughts. It depends on the level here too. Okay? So you kind of quickly do that, just to build a little bit of schema. And maybe there might be some vocabulary in the text that's very difficult, and maybe at this point you might want to teach that expression. Okay?
Then you have 5 minutes remaining.
5 minutes, yeah. We'll be able to do it.
Perfect.
Okay, so giving them parts of the text. The boy who came up from the cold, that's the title, and then you give them parts of the first sentence. A schoolboy who spent the night trapped in a butcher's cold store after being locked in accidentally. So you give them that, and then you have them write down, and this is part of a handout, you have them write down 3 questions they think will be answered by the end of the text. Okay, so if I can just quickly ask any of you, is any question coming to your mind right now?
How did he get locked in?
How did he get locked in? Okay?
How did he get out?
How did he get out? How did he survive? Okay, so so students end up writing their individually. Right now it's still individually. So they write that individually. After they've individually written their answers, then you have them share what they wrote with a partner in pairs. And then they will each have they will have different questions. So together they have to decide which 3 questions they think are the most interesting ones. And then you have them rewrite their questions, the 3 that they chose, and you have them think about the grammar at this point. So this is where you add a little bit of accuracy, make them focus on form a little bit. So I want you to think about the grammar of your question. Okay, so you kind of push them to do that. And then after they've selected their text, their questions, and this is where the real interaction occurs and where the task occurs. Now, together with your partner, try to think of possible answers to your 3 questions. So this is where the prediction comes in. And I want you to prepare a presentation of your questions and answers. So this is where the real task occurs. Together they have to come up with answers to their questions. And the goal of the task is to come up with answers to their questions and then to present them verbally. So in pairs. And then you'll choose 2 or 3 pairs to present their answers. And a lot of times the students come up with a lot of imaginative, even humorous answers to their questions. So a lot of fluency development, a lot of focus on meaning going on here. And motivation as well. Right? Of course, at this point, you give the students the text itself. So after presentations, you give them the text, and they're dying to read the text at this point. Okay? And it's very short. You can see it here. If you want a copy, I can give you a copy after. Okay? I was going to give it to you, but we don't have enough time. So what I want to highlight here is that this way is so much better than, okay, I'm going to give you this, and then I have maybe 8 comprehension questions. Okay? Read the text and answer the 8 comprehension questions. Okay? A lot of times, that happens, and it has its benefits. But this is so much more beneficial for their acquisition. So as I said, so now students are going to want to read this. They're going to be motivationally engaged as they read. And because we've already activated their schema, they're going to read, as I meant, they're going to read this more quickly. And they're going to comprehend the language. Even though it might be very challenging and it's an authentic text, they're going to want to understand this. And they're going to want to understand some of the vocabulary as well. Okay, so you might see them check their cell phone dictionary as well, if you allow that in your class. Okay, but we're not done here because we have to do the focus on form. There's lots of opportunities for language learning here if we can analyze the language in here. So as a teacher, you can decide you can decide what you want to focus on. So very quickly, find 6 phrases in the article which refer to the cold and its effects. So there's expressions related